Let's take a look at hill shading in ProRaster. I'm using ProRaster Premium. So I'll create a new lookup table algorithm. So hill shading is controlled by this intensity component in the lookup table color layer. And the same things are also found in the RGB color layer and the image layer. So you can do hill shading on any kind of layer. So let's just load some magnetic data. Just go in and change the color transform. And by default, ProRaster, when you load a raster source into your color component, it will also populate the intensity component with that raster source, at least the first time that you do it. So we have now a rendering of magnetic color with shadow also coming from the magnetic data. So if we just zoom into some area, so you can see a series of various dikes and perhaps granitic intrusions and so forth, and they're all being highlighted by the hill shading or the shadow. So let's click on the intensity component and then go over to the shadow property page. So there are three things here. You have your shadow controls, you have your specular highlight controls, and then you have this interactive control where you can change the altitude and the azimuth of both of those things. So these things can be enabled and disabled independently. So for example, we can turn off the highlight and just have shadow. Or if we turn off shadow, then we've just got color. Or you can just turn on highlight by itself if you want to. Let's turn those both on. Perhaps we'll turn highlight off for the time being. So we can change the azimuth and the altitude of the sun angle from here. So let's grab it, move it around to here, and that will change your shadow. Perhaps if we just zoom in a bit, so this is more obvious. So here the sun is shining from the northwest, and so we get our shadow generated to the southeast. Here the sun is shining from the north, and so we get our shadow down on the southern edge of these virtually east-west dikes. So generally speaking, you'll either have your shadow over here in the northeast, your sun angle, your sun over here in the northeast, or over here in the northwest. Though it might depend on the prevailing strike of features in your data. So, in some circumstances, it will be in other directions. But for things like terrain, you'll usually have it from somewhere in the northern quadrant, I think, because that sort of works with people's minds more easily. They can interpret what that shadow means. So you've got your azimuth, that's the sun angle from north and around the compass. So let's put that on 315 degrees out here on the northwest. This is your altitude, so 30 degrees is quite a low sun angle, 60 degrees is fairly normal, and if you go right up to 90 degrees where the sun is shining from directly above, you get this kind of interesting effect. You usually have it down around 60 degrees. And then you have the shadow scale here. So this scale parameter determines the depth of the shadow. So if I wind this back a little bit to 40, you'll see that the shadow, the depth of that shadow was just progressively decreasing. Back to 20, back to 10. And now we've almost got no shadow. So you can control all of these things in a plethora of ways. You can grab these sliders, use these up-down controls, or of course with the altitude and whatnot, you can control it from there. So let's bring that back to normal. So turn our highlight on. Highlight is kind of a specular highlight. In the old days we used to call it a wet look because it makes the data look kind of shiny. You can see these kind of white areas. So it's kind of good with data like this, with magnetic data. With terrain data, you probably want to dial it back a little bit. And the controls for this are all exactly the same. So here's the sun for our highlight. Probably you want to put it in the same place as the sun for your shadow, and you move that around by holding down the right mouse button, clicking and holding, and that will move around that specular highlight position, whereas the left mouse button moves the shadow position. And once again, you've also got this scale parameter, so you can dial this up and down, and it has a fairly dramatic effect on that specular highlight. It will tighten it up if you go to higher values, or if you go to lower values, it will really kind of wash it out further. Okay, so that's your basic controls. If you go up to the layer page and go onto the color property page, you'll see there's another thing here called the color intensity balance. So this allows you just to scale either the shadow or the color back and forth. So if I drag it right over to the left here, I get almost no color and full shadow. So we go from full shadow, slowly bringing in more and more color until we've got full shadow and full color. Now we have full color, and now shadow is starting to drop out. So as you get up to these higher values, you can see that you lose that sort of depth of shadow, but you still get a nice representation of the detail in the data, and the shadow is still giving you a good indication that there's more to be seen in the data than you would see if you were just looking at the colors alone. And so I like to, by default, I generally have this color intensity balance dialed up a little bit just to take some of the harshness out of the shadow, and I think it gives you a nice looking visualization. Just go back to the shadow property page. There's just one other control on this property page, and that's the manual statistics. So this is an advanced option. When it computes the shadow, it has to scale the data. And so there's a magic number in there that's used to scale the data. And if you want to manually control what that number is, you can do it by turning that on and putting some number in here. So you usually won't need to do that. But if in the event that the statistical analysis has come up with a bad number, then you might want to control it manually. And secondly, when you're looking at different rasters of different resolutions in the same view, then you can use this to control the shadow for those rasters and try to get a better blended effect. But it certainly is an advanced option that you won't use very often. So it doesn't give you any clue as to what number is the right number, but if I put in a number here, 100, it's lost all the shadow. If I go 10, that's looking okay. If I go 1, well, now I've clearly got too much shadow. So an appropriate number is somewhere around 10, and it's just going to be trial and error. Okay, so we get rid of that algorithm. Let's create another algorithm. Just choose this merit DEM. So here's our global DEM, and we're getting shadow from the terrain data. So I'll just choose a lookup table to go with that. So this is a data mapped lookup table, so colors are mapping to specific data values. Now I'm going to add in a second layer on the top. I think I'll have to browse to this one. I don't have a raster source. So we'll go in here, in here, this one. Okay, so this little raster is a high resolution terrain raster from LiDAR data. And we've got it sitting on top of the lower resolution DEM. So there it is. It's using a different color scheme. So let's fix that. Go into color, choose the external folder. I'm going to want that Atlas color table. Okay, so if we come up here, let's have a look at a couple of different things. So firstly, so here's the boundary between our high resolution and lower resolution data. And firstly, looking at that shadow scale, this one looks a little bit dark, so this might be one of these cases where you can come into your shadow page for this, turn on manual statistics, and choose something, maybe 0.4, let's see, 0.2, no, it's maybe a bit too much, 0.3, choose something that might be a little bit better match to the global data that you're looking at. So I think that's actually a pretty good match. The other thing I want to show with this is that at the moment the shadow direction and the highlights for both of these two layers can be moved independently. So we can go to this one and we'll turn the highlight off, and we'll turn this over to here. So now we're getting shadow from this direction, whereas mirrored it's coming from this direction. We have highlights. Now when you have multiple layers like this, you probably want to control it all independently. So if you go up to the algorithm level in the tree, you'll find there's a shadow property page, and now I can enable an override, and that allows me to move the shadow direction and the highlight direction and everything from the top level, and apply those settings to every layer in the tree, so we're getting the same shadow direction for different rasters. And that's hill shading in ProRaster.